Hi. That's like the old Chevy Chase routine when they come on and he's, like got his finger in his ear. Anyway, to continue, we were talking about Israel, and as I said, I think there are kind of two major arguments made for U.S. support of Israel. One being kind of domestic politics, the power of the so-called Jewish lobby at home, and I think that's clearly established. There's a lot of literature on that. In fact, a very good book by a congressman a few years back named Paul Findley, who was actually a Republican, who was defeated along Charles Percy, another Republican, was defeated because they were very mildly critical of Israel, and they both were defeated in the next election. So Paul Findley wrote a book about it, listing 20-some different people whose careers had suffered as a result of what he argued was their criticism of Israel. People like George Ball, a very well-known diplomat, Jesse Jackson, people like that. That's one argument. I actually follow the kind of cop on the beat argument, which is what I call it. I think that the United States perceives the Middle East as a hostile area, as an important and potentially or actually hostile area, surrounded by a lot of states which could potentially harm the U.S. And one way that any major power conducts foreign affairs is to get basically proxies in a particular region, so you don't have to do the dirty work yourself. As I said, I mean, one thing that's striking is it's 2004, and this is really the first time that we've seen the United States in a large-scale engagement in the Middle East, even though it's been deeply involved for some time. One major reason for that is because it's had others do its bidding for it, and here's where Israel comes in. Israel is America's gendarme. They're the cop on the beat. All right? The United States is capable, through its resources, to give incredible levels of aid and military equipment to Israel. And therefore, Israel can essentially maintain America's strategic and security concerns in that region, so that the U.S. itself doesn't have to. I believe in it may have been in 73, it may have been in 71 after I think it was in 1973 after the Six-Day War. Nixon said something to the effect that Israel is the cheapest strategic power we have in that region. It's a lot cheaper to have somebody else do it, so you don't have to do it yourself. And I think you can kind of see both of these strains from the beginning. I'm just going to talk a little bit about American-Israeli relationship, the so-called special relationship, and then we'll get back to it later. I'll probably do a whole class just on the Middle East from the 50s and 60s onward. But I want to just kind of establish a little bit right now about that. Israel, you're probably aware, was created in 1948 by a vote of the United Nations. There was an incredible demand, outcry to give the Jews a national state, of course, after the Holocaust of World War II. The issue itself was incredibly complex, emerging out of the League of Nations in World War I, and I'm going to talk more about that. Actually, I want to kind of do that kind of background later. But in 1948, you had a movement of Zionists. And actually, let me turn that on. It's a phrase I'm sure you've come across before. Okay. Zionists were Jews who believed that all Jews deserved a homeland in the historical and biblical area of their origin in Israel and Palestine. So there had been a strong Zionist movement. I believe it gets started in Europe in the mid-19th century for some time. So there was this demand, not just because of the horrors of the Holocaust, but this ongoing demand by Zionists to have a homeland, and dovetails with the horror of the Holocaust in the 1940s. And so there's this international recognition that, yes, Israel should be a state, should be a recognized state. In the United States, the issue wasn't so clear. there clearly were a lot of Americans advocating for Israel to be given, recognition. However, Truman and his advisors were also obviously aware of the importance of Middle Eastern oil. And they had a collection, as we've seen, of very reliable allies who were anti-communist but also anti-democratic. These are the people overthrown by the Nasserites. But in the late 40s, the King Faisals and King Farouks of the region are very strong American allies. They are anti-communist, they do not run democracies, and they are firmly in America's corner in the Cold War, right? So these are all, kind of factors. The U.S. has this nice system set up in the Middle East of reliable anti-communist Arab states, and it also understands that oil is very important as well. But Truman, and there have been a lot of books written on this, Truman himself was quite candid that he wanted Jewish money and Jewish votes in the election of 1948. I say this just because it's a great story that you can't pass on, but there was a lot of border skirmishing and what you would probably, you would have to call terrorism going on in 1948. And the ambassador to the United Nations, Warren Austin, was there when a Jewish and Arab representatives got into a big verbal fight. They started yelling and screaming at each other. And Warren Austin decided to play peacemaker, and he said, you guys need to settle this problem in the true Christian spirit. Muslim and Jew, right? So it's a good story. You have to tell it, right? Unremarkably, they didn't do it. It went unheeded. In 1947, then Truman supported a UN proposal. Let me see if the map of the Middle East. I forgot to put a map of Israel on here. I'll add one. This is Israel. It's a real tiny state here. All right. In 1947, Truman supported a UN proposal to partition Palestine into two states, a separate Jewish and Arab states. Conflict broke out. Zionists were getting large levels of support from American Jews, and they drove about 60% of the Palestinians out of Palestine into Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere. Jordans and Lebanon are here. All right, so you have this massive exodus. Golda Meir would later say that Israel was, a land without people for a people without land. But in fact, millions of Palestinians were driven out of Palestine. And so the Zionists, Israel ends up occupying 77% of Palestine. Truman recognizes Israel in May of 1948, probably for domestic political considerations as much as anything. After that, the U.S. and Israel continued to draw closer, although the United States continued to try to play kind of a double game. It did not, nowadays the U.S. is, clearly attached. In the Middle East, the U.S. and Israel are almost seen as the same thing. There's virtually indistinguishable. The U.S. in the 50s, however, is still trying to play this double game. U.S. officials were divided on throwing so much support, in fact, to Israel. A lot of military people said that the U.S. had to be careful. we should avoid alienating the Arabs. Omar Bradley, who's the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, we would need friendly Arabs all along the Mediterranean for our bases and lines and communications. All right, the kind of the idea that will emerge again in Suez, that we can't afford to alienate the Arab states because we need access to Suez, to the Mediterranean, and elsewhere. Truman, however, says, we are not doing what we should do to arm the Jews appropriately. So Truman actually breaks with his military people and says we have to continue to support Israel. One State Department official said Israel figures prominently in the American domestic political scene, thereby adding credence to the kind of whole power of the Israeli lobby in the U.S. argument. The United States, however, essentially does fall in with Israel and actually commits itself to guaranteeing the borders that were established in 1948 between Israel and Palestine, which, remember, gave Israel 77% of the land, including the water, which is really vital. Water in Israel is like oil. And so Israel gets the water. Once the U.S. makes a stand, it's essentially drawn in to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. In 1953, a CIA analysis said this is going to get worse. It said Israel has too many people who are admitted too rapidly into an area which possesses almost no natural resources. Meanwhile, Israel's budget, this is the CIA, depends on funds advanced by the United States government. Okay? Most Israeli officials, the CIA goes on, most Israeli officials will try to alleviate their problems by territorial expansion. And what will that do? The CIA says it will bring on Arab hostility. So this is a 1953 CIA report which basically spells it out. All right, Israel is going to expand. They're going to have to acquire other territories. And once that happens, the Arab world will respond in a hostile manner. Nasser's emergence actually brings the U.S. and Israel closer together. As I said, Nasser, when he overthrew Farouk, was somewhat encouraging because he did have these ideas for modernization. At the same time, however, Israel saw Nasser as a real threat. And so when Nasser actually asks Eisenhower for economic and military aid, Truman isn't out yet. He's a lame duck, for military and economic aid. But the U.S. says the only way we'll give Egypt aid is if we give Israel the same amount, in addition to what we're already giving them. So there's this kind of idea that if we're going to sponsor or support any Arab state, then Israel has to be given that same level too. Still, Israel and the Israeli-Arab conflict continued. The United States continues to fall in with Israel. There are border disputes. There are resettlement disputes. Israel begins raiding Egyptian camps along the Gaza Strip in 1955. This is, remember, when Nasser gets very upset because the Israelis are raiding camps on his border. And this is essentially what convinces him to go to Czechoslovakia to purchase weapons from the Czechs when Israel, which he considers an American client state, begins raiding his border with American equipment. Skirmishing actually breaks out in 1955, and the UN had to come in and broker a ceasefire. In that actually in the period before independence, a lot of terrorism took place. There was a group called the Stern Gang, which included Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon in it. Those names should mean something to you. They've both been prime ministers of Israel. The Stern Gang actually, in order to get the British out of Israel, was blowing up British installations. At one point, they blew up a place where a lot of British officials were staying called the King David Hotel. And I forget how many were killed in that explosion. It was over 100, I believe. I could be wrong about that. But there were a lot of these kind of, which really need to be labeled terrorist attacks. So this kind of skirmishing and these kinds of attacks continued into the 50s. In the 50s, the United States granted over $400 million to Israel, which, even when adjusted for inflation, compared to today's aid, wasn't that great. But still, in today's money, that would be, $3 or $4 billion, probably $400 million. But it was, compared to what the U.S. had done prior to that, was a significant increase. And in addition to that, clearly is in an area of concern, to the Arab states. When Israel joins in the attack on Suez, the Arab world, really kind of sees this as a validation for what it had been warning against for a long time. They believed that Israel was a client of the U.S. The Americans now clearly believe that Israel, even though the U.S. had to repudiate Suez, the U.S. believes that Israel is a strategic asset to the Americans in the Cold War. Israel is a strong force. It's kind of ironic. Guess which the first state to recognize Israel was? First country to recognize Israel? Soviet Union, yeah. And remember, Hitler, had considered, Zionism or, Jews and Bolsheviks to be the same. Ironically, though, Israel becomes a major bulwark against communism in the region, too, so it has a vital role to play in the Cold War. Israel will stand up to communism and to nationalism, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. You're right. I mean, in fact, there were a lot of the founders of Israel were socialists, and I mean, David Ben-Gurion always considered himself socialist. So that clearly, and now and clearly the U.S. wanted to get a foothold in there to prevent Israel. I mean, I think there was kind of a pipe dream on behalf of the Soviet Union that it could have that kind of an influence in Israel. By 1947 and 48, I mean, clearly the Israelis, a lot of money was coming in, especially from American Jews and British Jews. So, I mean, that had a huge role to play, But yeah, there clearly was always this historical connection between Zionism and Bolshevism, So, and that's something that does, factor in, although the U.S. clearly, wins that one. And it believes, increasingly that if you give Israel enough support, enough weapons, enough money, then they will contain any potential enemies of the United States in that region. In 1958, the National Security Council says that the logical corollary to opposing radical Arab nationalism would be to support Israel as the only strong pro-West power left in the Near East. As a result of that, Israel serves then as America's gendarme, as its cop on the beat against Arab nationalism, against Nasser, against the Soviet Union, or against anybody that the U.S. sees as a threat to its Middle East interest. Increasingly, the Arab world really focuses on the American relationship with Israel. This is another, kind of historical analysis. Those documents I mentioned earlier, kind of anti-Americanism in the Middle East and the NSC report of 1953, both speak about American support of Israel against the Palestinians as being a real issue throughout the Middle East. Right. Anybody have any questions on this stuff? Yeah.
Did the effects of the United States recognizing Israel destabilize the monarchies, and that's why they started falling?
Nah, I don't know enough about it to say definitively that it didn't, but I don't think so. I tend to think that there was this rush throughout the world after World War II. There was this kind of democracy movement. The forces of movement were kind of on the offensive, and these kind of new ideas of modernization and development, especially among younger people, had emerged. And this is also a period of anti-colonialism. Remember, the British Empire is breaking apart, and India gets its freedom, and so I think it's more kind of a product of those kind of historical world forces, that are occurring throughout the Third World. And, Nasserism clearly, fits into that. And the U.S. is encouraging it. Remember, the U.S. is an anti-colonial power in the sense that kind of imperialism, that traditional European imperialism, is closing it out. So, I mean, clearly the U.S. would, Egypt is a British colony. So why wouldn't the U.S. want Egypt to be sovereign? So I think it's more like that. I mean, I think the American relationship with Israel, clearly, it's something everybody's aware of. It's sitting there, it's big, but it's not, we kind of look backward on it today and it's huge. It's not quite that big in the 40s. It's something to think about, but I tend to think that the attacks on Farouk and Faisal and this, clearly are part of this historical process. Now, their connections to the U.S. don't serve them well. They are seen as puppets of the West. And, clearly, a whole lot of money is leaving those countries and going to Western oil companies. And the 53 coup was really big in that in Iran. I mean, I think that's really a major watershed event. Just like, you will hear subsequent generations of Arab nationalists talk about Nasser, they'll talk about the 53 coup, and they'll talk about Suez. I mean, if you had to pinpoint like the grade school test, pick three major events, it would be the coup in Iran, the emergence of Nasser and Suez would definitely have long-term consequences in that region. And the U.S. support of Israel, make it 4. Somebody, yeah.
Was there an express racial element in
Against Arabs? I don't really study history that way. I'm sure there are people who have and who suggested that. Actually, I shouldn't say that because if you've ever read Said, like Orientalism, which is just a brilliant book, I mean, clearly there's always been this sense that the Arab world is dangerous, and I mean the whole Hollywood conception of that didn't just emerge out of nowhere. You can see that in literature and opera and in theater for centuries. But I also think that when these guys sit down, they're thinking of power. And so they got along quite well with the Arab states throughout World War II. They got along quite well with Faisal and Farouk. There didn't seem to be any barriers based on ethnicity or culture when the U.S., was using them as client states. When that shifts, when the Middle East, in a sense, turns, and the kind of Nasserites emerge, then I think, you do have this kind of more popular image in the U.S. But I mean, during World War II, American images of the Middle East were actually very favorable because, they had a meeting at Tehran, and in the U.S., these were all very, very comfortable, very secure spots for the U.S. These places were allied. They were keeping the Soviet Union out. So, but it was really easy, when that turned, to kind of portray, the kind of crazy raghead image that you see, increasingly over time. But I'm always skeptical of arguments which suggest that policy is based on like kind of race or ethnicity or things like that. I think there's a factor in it, but in general, those tend to be kind of ancillary factors. The big issues here are things like, security and commerce and trade and transportation. And in that regard, I think that's how the Middle East plays out. I mean, what's also striking, I mean, there's a strong level of opposition. When Truman recognized Israel, many of his major advisors, including Clark Clifford, advised him against it. And that was based on politics and oil, don't piss off the Arabs kind of thing. So I don't know. I think over time that the kind of cultural, ethnic points have grown stronger, actually. I mean, I don't know if it's subdued, but after communists used to always be the bad guys, with James Bond and everybody else. And as soon as communism kind of fell away, then it became Arabs and Arab terrorists and things like that, the grid and stuff like that. So I don't know. But in terms of, as being a motivating factor, I'm skeptical of that, although there are people who will argue that it was. I don't think it was that much. Any other? Yes?
You had made mention earlier that Israel received 77%
Of the land.
Palestinian land.
Yeah.
What the UN allotted them when they formed the nation?
It was more than that. I mean, I forget.
I was concerned that was what Israel is annexed.
No, I mean, if you include the 67, Gaza and Sinai and the West Bank, it was more than that.
Considerably more land since then that they
Yes,
as
yes.
they're doing it today.
Yes,
And it
yes.
goes back almost to the foundation of
Yes.
the state, does it not?
Yes. I don't have the numbers with me. It's more, I mean, 67, they took over Golan, Sinai, the West Bank, and what's the fourth one? Help me. You don't know? There's another one. And then the 78 agreement gave some of that back, although Gaza. 78, Camp David returned some of that. I can't remember what parts. And yeah, now, I mean, with the settlements, the resettlements and the bulldozing, yeah, it's significantly more. The fence, the wall, right, which I think the UN has just said to tear down too. So I don't really know the numbers, but yeah, it increases. It's increased over time. And the 77% of Palestine land came as a result of Israel driving a lot of Palestinians out. I can't remember the numbers. I believe, I know it's over 1 million. I don't know what time period that's in, but yeah, it was forcible removal. There's several people have, and I think I read something to that effect at the very beginning of the semester. There are accounts of the removal of Indians, from the American Southeast in the 1830s, and they sound remarkably similar to these accounts of Israel driving Palestinians out in the 1940s. I mean, they're virtually word for word, in some cases. So, yeah, it was a forcible removal. All right. Question? Any other questions? We spent a lot of time on this, which is fine. I mean, I think it's important, and I am going to do a lot more with it and pick it up from here to the present later on. But I want to get back to kind of more traditional Cold War in the 50s. And I want to talk a little bit about Eastern Europe. And this is interesting stuff for a couple reasons. One, we can do this now, as I said before, because since 1990, when everything kind of fell apart in Eastern Europe, a lot of Americans have been able to go there and get these records and translate them. And so we know a lot more about what was happening in Eastern Europe. So on one hand, it's really neat to do that. Secondly, it also gives a kind of a new story, a new version of the Cold War, which is really interesting. Because the typical discourse of the Cold War was that, remember, the Soviet Union was dominating Eastern Europe, and it held it had an Iron Curtain had descended, and the United States was controlling the Soviet Union was controlling events there. So it's part of this whole epic struggle between the free society and the slave, as NSC 68 put it. And what we see now with these documents is there's actually a great deal of flexibility in the Eastern Bloc. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it's really interesting stuff. And it again speaks to the issue of kind of what the reality of life was like, the political economic reality of life in Eastern Europe, as opposed to what the United States was saying about it in order to justify its particular policies, right? So at the same time, the United States is saying we have to have this massive arms buildup and we have to get rid of governments in Iran or Guatemala or wherever because the Soviet Union is doing all this kind of terrible stuff. The reality is, in fact, that wasn't the case. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important. The United States, and we've already seen this in the 50s, had rejected and opposed and gotten rid of governments, places like Iran or Guatemala, or tried to in Egypt, Indonesia, which did not follow America's design. And how did they do it? They raised the specter of communism to discredit these states or to legitimize these covert operations or these attacks on them. The Soviet Union acts in a very similar way. One of the major points I make when I write about the Cold War is that you can look at it as the conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. Clearly, you can look at it that way. The forces of democracy and capitalism versus the forces of communism. And on one level, that conflict, in Korea, China, Vietnam, you can clearly see that. But the Cold War also is kind of, and if that's kind of the East-West struggle, right? East versus West. But the Cold War, in a sense, is a North-South struggle, too, with global forces of power, the international ruling class, acting out against people who challenge that, all right? And this is really important. I probably should have introduced this earlier because I think it is important. So on one hand, it's the East versus the West, Soviet communism versus American democracy. But on another hand, in fact, the leaders of the United States and Soviet Union are pursuing very similar goals. What are they trying to do? They're trying to maintain their own particular hegemony, their own particular power, both abroad, which means that if one of your satellite states acts up, you have to keep it in place. We've already seen how the U.S. does that in places like Guatemala or Iran. We're going to see how the Soviet Union does that in places like Germany and Hungary. All right? So, and it also means that you keep people contained at home. All right? And McCarthyism will do that, and we already know about Soviet repression. It's not a free society. There's no question about that. So what you have then, not only is the containment of communism, but what you have, I think, from kind of a north-south, if I can use that metaphor as a perspective, is the containment of nationalism and democracy. Just as the United States wants to contain Nasser, not because he's a communist, but because he's a nationalist, because he's doing things in a different way, the Soviet Union will want to contain, Poland and Hungary because they're doing things a different way. They're doing socialism differently. All right. So this is a major. The Cold War is a lot of things. It's a dessert. It's a floor wax and a dessert topping. It's this conflict between the East and West, between communism and capitalism, but it's also this conflict from the top down, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the Chinese are basically on the same side. They're doing the same things. They're trying to suppress nations or individuals that would challenge them, the forces of nationalism, the forces of neutralism, the forces of democracy. All right? And so that's important to see it in that way. And that's what we're going to talk about, because the Soviet Union is going to be doing things very similar to what the U.S. does in that regard. In the 1950s, particularly in East Germany and Hungary and Poland, there were challenges to the Soviet system. It is a big mistake to see the Soviet Union as this powerful, monolithic, unyielding bloc which gets its way and dominates everybody with total coercion. It's not true. All right? Both superpowers act in very similar ways when confronted with challenges to their hegemony. And so the Cold War may have evolved from this Soviet-American confrontation into something quite different, into a conflict in which the Americans and the Russians similarly saw other nations that steered a different path as enemies, or saw forces of democracy as enemies. The American sphere of influence was global, as we've seen. NSC 68 said that. The American sphere of influence is Latin America, it's Guatemala, it's the Middle East, it's Iran, it's Asia, it's going to be Vietnam, all right? It's Indonesia, it's India. Basically, the United States, plays big all over. The whole world is its playing field. The Soviet Union was still considerably less powerful and had much more narrow ambitions, as particularly confined to Eastern Europe. So within that context, then, the Soviet Union does see challenges to its power, but they occur essentially in its own backyard, in their own sphere, in places like Germany and Hungary and Poland. The first challenge comes in 1953. There's a crisis in Germany. This is the first real challenge to Soviet hegemony, Soviet power in the Cold War. And the Soviet Union, just like the Americans, reacted harshly and decisively. To make a long story short, the leader of the Soviet Union, of Germany, was a guy named Walter Ulbricht, which I have up here. And Ulbricht was basically a Stalinist, right? And he had created in East Germany, in the German Democratic Republic, basically a Stalinist state, all right? And the economic program he had instituted was a mess. And so between 1951 and 1953, almost 500,000 people had fled East Germany to go to the West because the economy was such a mess, such a disaster, right? Stalin dies in March of 1953, and things get worse. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt to ask, when you said it's a Stalinist kind of a system, do you mean like in terms of heavy-handed economic planning?
Yeah, heavy industrialization, forced collectivization, taking land from farmers and collectivizing farms, heavy military industrialization, remilitarization, new taxes, difficult burdens, regulations and taxes on small businessmen and independent businessmen, things like that. Kind of heavy, Stalinist is what they did. Heavy forced industrialization. Everything else takes a backseat to heavy forced imposed industrialization. I mean, in the Soviet Union, it essentially worked in the sense that it took a backward country and created a global industrial power in a very short period of time. That was the agenda under Stalin, right? And I mean, the human consequences are grave. There's no question about that. And you can see this because it wasn't working in Eastern Germany. And so remember, Eastern Germany was not the plum. I mean, West Germany was the agriculture. That's where the Saar and the Ruhr are. East Germany was always more agricultural. So the Ulbricht is trying to kind of force this heavy industrialization on what was a more agricultural area, and it backfires. So you have this massive run where nearly 500,000 people bolt from East to West Germany in just a little over a couple years. Stalin dies, and there's these three guys vying for power: Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, who eventually wins out, and Lavrenti Beria, who was one of Stalin's hatchet men. He was in charge of the KGB under Stalin, and they basically tell Ulbricht that he needs to reverse course. He needs to adopt a new course because things are going so badly. In fact, ironically, Beria, who was Stalin's hatchet man, was willing to allow East Germany, to go. He just said, go ahead, do what you want. Basically, Beria was saying that East Germany could join West Germany, unified Germany. Beria was executed later that year by Khrushchev. Ironically, for being too pacific, right? I mean, he wasn't executed for running the KGB and being Stalin's right-hand man and doing God knows what. So, anyway, the situation in Germany gets dire. People, and remember, this communism, Marxism is supposed to be based on providing, a living to the working class. However, things are getting worse. The Soviet Union sends representatives to Germany. This is really striking. And the Soviet Union says the crash socialization, the Stalinist program that Ulbricht had created, was an incorrect political line, and it had created a very unsatisfactory political and economic situation. All right? So the Soviet Union says that the forced industrialization and the creation of these big agricultural collectives was a disaster. So the Soviet Union comes in, looks at East Germany, and says, Ulbricht screwed up by pursuing the Stalinist line. Stalin's dead now, so you can get away with that. Production was low, independent producers and artisans had been wiped out, workers were losing their jobs, it was a big mess. All right? Georgy Malenkov says, in fact, if we do not correct the situation now, a catastrophe will happen. In Germany, the working class is basically at the breaking point. And in June of 1953, East German workers take to the streets. In over 350 cities and villages, they hold demonstrations with over 500,000 protesters. This is in Eastern Germany. 500,000 people are in the streets protesting against the government's economic policies. All right? Think of that. Think of that. Can you think of anything comparable in the U.S.? Populist era, the great strikes of the late 19th century. How were those dealt with? They sent in the troops, yeah. Okay. The Soviet Union tried to restrain the East. Ulbricht wanted to just crush them. Ulbricht basically wanted a bloodbath. The Soviet Union tries to restrain that. Finally, Soviet troops go into Berlin, seal East Berlin off from the western sector, and declare martial law. At the end of the whole thing, 125 people were killed and thousands were arrested. Okay? Considering that there were 500,000 people in the streets, the numbers are strikingly limited, compared to what one would think. Ulbricht blames the Americans. He says they were trying to undercut things. The U.S. had been conducting some psychological operations, but nothing terribly serious. East German workers had rebelled against the state, and they were defeated, much like the Guatemalans or the Iranians had been. The Soviet Union, like the U.S., would not tolerate these displays of self-determination. In Eastern Germany, the fallout was pretty heavy. Ulbricht was attacked by the Soviet Union. They said he's lost touch with the masses. He's a dictator, right? Nonetheless, he remained in power. And Beria, the guy who was advocating a unified and peaceful Germany, was imprisoned and shot. It's just kind of ironic. This is kind of another kind of amusing thing that comes out. I'm not sure how amusing it is, but there was a big debate. I mean, we always think of, remember the idea, and you're probably too young to remember that, but the idea was that the Soviet Union was this closed society. No one could speak out. No one could do anything differently. As soon as you did that, they would take you away in the middle of the night and execute you. And in fact, what we see in East Germany is that wasn't the case. Right? I mean, 500,000 people took to the streets. It was suppressed. There's no question about that. But that was what happened. That was what happened. It was suppressed. And in fact, there was a big debate in the Politburo, in the equivalent of the Congress of Eastern Europe, And everybody starts yelling about what to do with Ulbricht, because there were a lot of people who wanted to get rid of him. And finally, one Soviet official writes, "This is not a Politburo, this is a madhouse." Okay? So even in Eastern Europe, you had you had serious disagreements and serious questions about the role of the state. Right? In the end, stability, which meant continued control by Ulbricht and the GDR, remained in place. This also exposes the limits of U.S. power. I mean, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had talked a lot about liberation and rollback, but when push came to shove, the U.S. really couldn't do much. What was it going to do? Send troops in to Eastern Germany, right? So there's not a whole lot to do. The U.S., despite the rhetoric of rollback and containment, has to be kind of realistic. And so when faced by a conflict in Poland a few years later, kind of does the same thing. The Poles were having an uprising, and the U.S., kind of rhetorically says, this is wrong, and it kind of tries to get the Poles to act up, but nothing really, comes of it. In 1956, two more major crises occur, and these are really kind of telling, I think. There are comparable uprisings in the Soviet Union sphere, in Hungary and in Poland. And they say a lot about the nature of the Cold War. First off, in early 1956, Khrushchev, who wins the power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev, makes a remarkable speech in which he essentially tells the truth about Stalin. The famous de-Stalinization speech, where Khrushchev gets up and he talks about the secret prisons and the repression and the murders and everything else. And people are stunned. They had been told all along, what a great guy he was. And Khrushchev reveals about everything, all this evil. He says, "We must assert that in regard to these persons who in their time had opposed the party line, there were often no sufficiently serious reasons for their physical annihilation. The formula, enemy of the people, was specifically introduced for the purpose of physically annihilating such individuals." This is Khrushchev admitting what Stalin had done. Just, what?
Like these were true.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really striking. This is only 3 years after Stalin had died. I mean, considering it took how many years for finally Bill Clinton to apologize for slavery, right? Like 130 years, Clinton finally had to give this really mealy-mouthed, pathetic apology for slavery. And here's, Khrushchev 3 years after Stalin's death saying this guy was brutal. He was annihilating people. So this is for a lot of people, this is very encouraging. They see this new opening in the Soviet Union. And so a lot of people are hopeful for the future. Khrushchev he's obviously no Stalin. Things are much different in the USSR. Totally different. And in both Poland and Hungary, local communists say, hey, we can do things now we could have never done before. It's a new world out there. So in Poland, a de-Stalinization campaign begins under the leadership of Władysław Gomulka. Name is on there, Gomulka in Poland. Gomulka is kind of a liberal reformer, all right? He was always considered a little independent, but now, things are different. Khrushchev is in charge, Stalin isn't, so Gomulka's okay. In 1956, Poland was still led by kind of the old guard, the old Stalinist guard, and as what had happened in Germany in 53, in 56, there were workers' uprisings in Poland, in a city called Poznan. Polish demonstrators who wanted better working conditions and better wages kind of go crazy, and they attack the offices of the Communist Party and the secret police, and eventually the government sends in the guards to crush the uprising, but things don't stop there. Yeah. Oh, of course. Oh, absolutely. I mean, both sides did, Oh, yeah. I mean, those stories were prominent. What's ironic, when I'll talk about Hungary in 56, the Soviet Union invades Hungary, right, to crush this workers' rebellion. What happens on that same day? Anybody know? Because the U.S. didn't really get a whole lot of propaganda value out of it, because it was the same day that Britain and France invaded Suez. So it's kind of hard to, condemn the Soviet Union for what it does in Hungary when the British and the French are at that very moment attacking Egypt, right? So, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Americans have a field day with this. And, you know, Voice of America has been, I haven't done much with stuff like that. You're familiar with like some of the propaganda wings like the U.S. Information Agency and Voice of America. And they're broadcasting into Eastern Europe all the time. And they're talking about, there's an uprising, join your brothers in the streets, get rid of the government, that kind of thing, you know. So, yeah, absolutely. The Americans are clearly having a good time with this. So in Poland, the workers and intellectuals and other groups begin to demand change. They're dissatisfied with the way the state is being run. And so they approach Gomulka. And Gomulka says to them, I'll return to power. I'll come back. You know, I'll run. I'll be your representative. But if I do that, I want the Soviet soldiers and advisors to leave. I want Soviet officials to leave the Polish Politburo. Gomulka, now this is really striking. Think about this. Imagine in 1956, you know, McCarthyism is still very strong even though McCarthy's dead. Imagine somebody going on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1956 and saying, I don't believe in American democracy, and I'll only come back and represent you in power if you get rid of democracy and capitalism. Right? Would that happen? Would that ever happen? Of course not. Gomulka says, this is the guy who's going to lead Poland. He says, comrades, you have failed to notice the climate prevailing among the working class in the nation. Everything that has so far been done was wrong. It is possible to rule a nation without enjoying its trust, but such a rule can only be maintained with bayonets. Okay? Gomulka says, I am returning to work under an anti-Soviet slogan. The atmosphere in Poland is anti-Soviet. All right? This is the guy who's taken over now. He's in charge of Poland. You know, can you imagine that? You know, you have failed to notice the climate is preventing everything that has been far is wrong. Right? I am returning to work under an anti-Soviet slogan. All right. Now, what would you assume happened to Gomulka? I mean, in the American version of events, he would have been executed on the spot by Soviet agents, right? He would go the way of Lavrenti Beria, right? But it didn't happen. Gomulka took over, right? Can you imagine somebody saying, I'll only come to power, but I'm coming to power under an anti-American slogan? The atmosphere in the United States is anti-American, you know? So again, my point here is that we have to kind of see these things in a more nuanced way. All right? Despite all the rhetoric, the Soviet Union could not control events all over, even in its own backyard, even in Poland. So Gomulka comes to power, and the Soviet Union's pissed off. All right? Khrushchev, Molotov, the foreign minister, and others just go to Warsaw. They're not even invited. They just show up. Soviet military units begin to move on Poland. Gomulka's security forces begin to take positions to withstand an attack from the Soviet Union. Poland expects that the Soviet Union will invade and attack them. All right? The Soviet Union arrives in and goes off on Gomulka. They said, what is this agent of Wall Street and the Zionists doing here? They're accusing Gomulka of being a capitalist tool or a Jewish tool. All right? The Poles refused to back down. The Polish Politburo and the Polish people said, Gomulka's our guy. We're going to back him up. Gomulka says, look, I'm not a threat to you. I'm going to do things differently, but I'm still a communist. I'll still be in the Warsaw Pact. All right? The Warsaw Pact was, remember, the Eastern European equivalent to NATO. Right? So what does the Soviet Union do? What does the Soviet Union do? This guy's saying, I'm an anti-Soviet. You know, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. What does the Soviet Union do to Gomulka in 1956? They get back on their planes and they head back to Moscow. He remains in power. All right? Basically, he said, I'm still a communist.
Because I was just thinking maybe they didn't do anything because they thought maybe the United States was backing somewhere.
No, he said, look, I'm not going to leave the Warsaw Pact. I'm a communist. You don't have to worry about me. I'm going to do things differently. I'm not a Stalinist. I'm not going to let you tell me what to do. I reject Soviet power, but I'm still a communist. They got back on their planes and they left. Compare that to our Benz or Mossadegh. All right? Hence my question, would you rather be a peasant in Guatemala or a dock worker in Poland in the 1950s? It's an easy answer. It's an easy call. In 1956, just a little bit, kind of simultaneous with the Polish crisis, there's a crisis in Hungary, and that ends a little bit differently. All right? In Hungary, there had been a reformist named Imre Nagy, N-A-G-Y, in power. And he had been removed. All right? However, like Gomulka, Nagy was really, kind of an icon to a lot of the forces for change in Hungary, right? In 1956, Hungary began to have a crisis similar to that in Poland, where workers and farmers and intellectuals were out in the streets demanding change, right? The leader of Hungary at the time was a kind of an old hack Stalinist, a guy named Erno Gero. And Gero was threatened by the people in the streets. Ironically, the Soviet ambassador to Hungary at the time was a guy named Yuri Andropov. I don't know if that name means anything to any of you, but he was actually, I think, the next to last leader of the Soviet Union. He was right before Gorbachev, right? He was before Chernenko? Oh, okay. There was a string there where like 3 of them all died within about a year. Andropov was briefly the general secretary. He was in charge of the Soviet Union right before, not right before, but pretty much right before Gorbachev. So Andropov and Gero want Soviet intervention. In October, however, Imre Nagy comes back into power with János Kodar as the party chief. And Nagy and Kadar are kind of like Gomulka. They're reformist, and they will bring stability and peace. However, they do a little bit different. For one thing, whereas Gomulka, the most important factor is Gomulka had said, I'm a communist, I'm not going to leave the Warsaw Pact. What did Nagy do? Nagy says, we are neutral in East-West matters, and we will not be a member of the Warsaw Pact. Okay? Gomulka never said that. As a result, 60,000 Soviet troops and tanks poured into Hungary, ended the uprising, and took control of the government. All right? The biggest difference there was that Gomulka said, I'm not going to leave the Warsaw Pact, I'm still a good commie. And Nagy said, I no longer will be on the Soviet side, I'm going to be neutral, and Hungary will withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. All right? And again, using this, the kind of what Chomsky calls the concept of universality. How would the U.S. respond if, a major country, let's say Italy, decided that it was going to, pull out of NATO, right? Well, it would overthrow the government. I mean, it did it plenty, What did it do when Arbenz wanted to, confiscate land from UFCO? What did it do when Mossadegh wanted to nationalize oil? So, clearly they're acting in very much the same way. I think what's striking in the Polish case, and actually in the Hungarian case, Nagy would have stayed in power if he had not denounced NATO, the Warsaw Pact. That's pretty clear for from all indications. Had Nagy done what Gomulka had done and said, I'm still a loyal communist and I'll be in the Warsaw Pact, he would have remained in power, and the reforms could have taken place. There's almost no doubt about that. Right? He didn't do it, and so he was ousted. About 4,000 to 20,000 Hungarians died in the Soviet intervention. The numbers are all over the place. A lot of people were arrested. About 300 were executed. About 200,000 people fled into Austria. Gomulka had never wavered in his allegiance, but Nagy's neutrality and especially his repudiation of the alliance were too much for Khrushchev to bear, and so helped get rid of him. Gomulka survived. Imre Nagy had his chances. You couldn't say the same for Mossadegh and Arbenz. So the Cold War was global. The Soviet Union and the U.S. act in very, very similar ways. They're both afraid of and opposed to their allies as much as each other. But I think one can make a case that there was actually more flexibility in Moscow at the time than there was in Washington, D.C. Okay. Anybody have any questions on this? Yes?
Are you using a lot of the new stuff?
This is all Cold War National History Project stuff, yeah.
I wonder if the Soviet leadership at the same time, I wonder if they're responding in the same way to things like the Bandung Conference and neutralism as are U.S. officials, if they're responding by, sometimes kind of being alarmist about it, but at the same time kind of embracing the possibilities of a neutralist movement so that you could gain some influence where the U.S. would lose influence. I wonder if you could find...
Oh, well, you mean the Soviet Union embracing it?
There are these parallel kinds of agendas between the Soviet Union and the United States,
Yeah.
the third world. And it's interesting that the documents, the one you're using, kind of bear that out.
Yeah.
I wonder if there are the same kinds of discussions about neutralism that you find...
Well, I would think that they would embrace it far more than the U.S. And neutralism is essentially to their advantage. because anything that breaks off from the American camp, right? The other dynamic, which I'm not really going to do much with, I'll talk a little bit about it, is the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet, the Chinese and the Russians don't get along. And they're both vying. Essentially, they're both going after the same target. It's like a candidates, right? There's particular demographic groups that everybody's fighting for. Well, in a sense, the Soviet Union and the Chinese are both kind of trying to portray themselves as the new champions of liberation. It's a role that the U.S. had always, assumed, right? People wanted to be, democracies like the United States. Ho Chi Minh, said, I want to be like the United States. So part of that, when they reach out to the third world, is that the Chinese actually have the initiative in the 50s. Mao Zedong has become far more than Stalin, a symbol of liberation, right? I mean, Mao helps him out in Korea. Stalin is kind of old and bureaucratic and staid. Mao is incredibly popular. He's the most famous face in the world, right? I mean, throughout Latin America, there are Maoists. In Asia, there are Maoists, of course. In Africa, there are Maoists. There are Maoists everywhere. You're not going to find people, with Khrushchevites, I mean, the icons are Mao and then later Che Guevara. And Che is actually not a pivotal figure. If you look at global politics at the time, I mean, Che was kind of the cover boy of the movement. He was the centerfold of the movement in a lot of ways. I mean, Castro and others did far more than Che Guevara did. But I think the Soviet Union was also kind of vying for the same kind of test group as China, as the Chinese were, as Mao Zedong was. And both, I think, understood and embraced that far more than the U.S. did. The U.S. didn't have to. I mean, the U.S. had so many built-in advantages, it didn't perceive that it had to. It didn't look ahead and say, wow, this could really come back and bite us on the butt 20 years from now. And it did. I mean, it clearly did, right? But, I mean, they weren't thinking that far ahead. They kept, I mean, power can be very arrogant, but often with reason. And they're basically thinking, we're so big and so powerful, we'll continue to get our way, and we'll do what we have to. And that generally has worked pretty well. But, there are limits to it, and clearly, you've seen that. But I think that the Cold War International History Project, which I've talked about before, you can go online, and it just has tons of stuff. It's an incredible resource. But they have, these documents, as they translate them, everything, they put them up there, so it's all up there for you to see. There's also the National Security Archive, which is a really great site, too. And, I mean, this stuff, there's a real big debate in Cold War history as to what it all means. And there's a famous Cold War historian, very conservative guy named John Gaddis. And Gaddis says, this proves that the Americans were right all along, that the Soviet Union was this horrible, hideous, evil system, and everything. The U.S., they would never negotiate with the U.S., and everything the U.S. did was necessary, right? And I mean, I don't see where that comes from. I mean, I don't see how you can read these things that way. The stuff on Poland was staggering. I was stunned when I read it. I mean, here you have Gomulka standing up and saying, if I come back, it's going to be as an anti-Soviet. I mean, imagine any system, embracing that. That's really radical change. That's radical change. Far more. I mean, this is at a period of McCarthyism in the U.S. So I think, it's not kind of a qualitative thing. One's better than the other. But at the same time, there is a level of flexibility there, which I think you have to take note of. I mean, at the same time this is happening, the United States is spending zillions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions overall, on an arms race based on the idea that the Soviet Union is a grave threat, right? Well, if that's true, then how do you account for the flexibility it shows in its own backyard, in Poland, in Hungary, even in Germany? In 1953, Olbrich survived, but it was actually, Olbrich violated what the Soviet Union wanted him to do. The Soviet Union wanted what they called the new course. Olbrich remained a rigid Stalinist and got away with it. But in those three cases, you see, a fairly impressive level of flexibility. In Germany, they wanted to remove the old Stalinist structure of industrialization. In Poland, as soon as Gomulka says, I'm going to stay in the Warsaw Pact, they got back on the plane and headed back, even though they didn't like the guy. And in Hungary, they were willing to deal with Nog until he said, I'm going to leave the alliance. You don't see comparable flexibility in Washington, D.C. You just don't. All right? Now, that doesn't mean the Soviet Union were good guys, but it doesn't have to. That's not the point. The point is that the United States was spending hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining McCarthyism at home, basing the idea that these people were such a threat to the Americans based on what they've already done and their intent, that we had to do that. We had to spend all this money. We needed McCarthyism at home. We had to have, a culture militarized. And that wasn't true. And that's why I get apoplectic. It just wasn't true. And for, there's a famous historian, Mel Leffler, who keeps talking about how prudent they were. Leffler writes this big several hundred-page book where he talks about all these documents in which the Americans say the Soviet Union's not a threat. They're weak. I'm going to read some of them later, some of these documents. They're weak. They're not going to do anything, all this kind of stuff. Well, remember NSC 162/2, I read part of that to you. Remember the language, the Soviet Union is unlikely to attack. And you remember that? All right. So if in fact that these people, the Soviet Union is not going to do that to you, how can it be wise and prudent to continue escalating an arms race and overthrowing governments and having McCarthyism at home if they're not a threat, nonetheless insisting that they are, right? And I think this Cold War International History Project stuff is really, really incredible in that regard. You don't have to like Khrushchev. There's no reason to like what they did in Eastern Europe, obviously. But at the same time, you have to recognize that there was a level of autonomy and flexibility there that ran totally contrary to what the U.S. was saying, while it justified these insane defense budgets and arms races and proxy overthrows and everything else. This is my lecture for the day. Yeah.
The level of government knowledge of all the things, was it just kind of on the fringes, or was it just dead on?
No, this was like the Polish and Hungarian stuff was in the New York Times. That was like public. Oh yeah, they're aware of this. There's agents all over the place and spies and counter spies, and a lot of this actually is. A lot of this stuff, like the Politburo meeting. This is not a Politburo. This is a madhouse. There's a Politburo meeting. Everybody knows about that. The Prov is not going to cover that way, but at the same time, this is not, if among those who have access, this is not that difficult. This is pretty open stuff. It's not at the same level as a U.S. Senate hearing, but at the same, it's easy to get at. The Americans are clearly aware of it. There's no doubt. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe they wanted to do themselves all these reforms in Russia, but they felt like maybe they had too many opposition for Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
So they let the Polish guy do maybe some of the stuff that they wanted to do to see if it would work, or the East German guy to see if it would work. And maybe
well, actually, in East Germany, they didn't do the reforms. They stuck to the old system. This is all connected, yeah. I think the de-Stalinization program of '56 clearly emboldens the Poles and the Hungarians. There's no question about that. Basically, they interpret Khrushchev's speech as saying, it's okay, you're free now, you don't have to worry. With Stalin, you're afraid he's going to kill you. I'm not like that. Khrushchev was. There's Soviet Union between, it's a night and day difference. It really is. All right.
The leaders that came out were like doxing and stuff, and Stalin was kind of crazy.
Oh, they did. They knew that a lot of stuff. There was a great deal of it was difficult to oppose the guy because he was everything that Khrushchev said he was. So yeah, there's no doubt. The de-Stalinization speech wasn't just like a cathartic "God, I'm sorry" to all of you. It was a way of saying we're going to do things differently now, and it's okay for us to do things differently because this guy was so totally nuts. So yeah, there's no question about that. Denouncing Stalin clearly has a political agenda. And clearly, gives, the light bulb goes on in Poland and Hungary saying, okay, if Khrushchev says that, then we're going to take him at his word and we're going to do things differently too. And, one of the real tragedies was that didn't take root, very quickly. You do have reforms. And again, I'm not sugarcoating it, but the propaganda about Eastern Europe didn't match the reality. It wasn't by any means a workers' paradise, and Soviet propaganda to that effect was obviously ridiculous, and everybody knew it was ridiculous. But at the same time, would you rather be a peasant in Cuba under Batista, or in Nicaragua under Somoza, or wherever, fill in the blank? There were levels of autonomy and flexibility there, which in fact, were worth noting. And for the Americans to use this kind of nightmarish, dark scenario to continue their own, arms buildup and defense budgets is what I find really reprehensible, because they knew it wasn't true, That's not to say the Soviet Union wasn't. It was a military power. It had atomic weapons. That's all true, absolutely. They were capable of using them? Of course they were. Were they likely to? No. Did that justify what the U.S. did? Absolutely not, I think. Absolutely not. The whole Cold War cost, what was it, $4 or $5 trillion, right? I mean, just think if you only spent half of that, you know, that still buys a lot of bullets and guns. And can you imagine what $2.5 trillion would do, you know? That's more than Bill Gates got, right? That's like 20 times, 100 times more than Bill Gates got, right? All right. Any other questions? I'll start talking a little bit about Asia, and I'll probably go through this pretty quickly. Asia, you know, the Cold War in Europe, which is kind of where, you know, the spotlight was always on Europe, right? But as we've seen, the Cold War in Europe really was fairly mild. I mean, you had the Berlin airlift crisis, and then after that, it's kind of internal. You know, you send tanks into Hungary, but that's not the East versus the West. That's the East versus the East. Poland is, you know, it's internal, right? Asia's much different. Asia's pretty intense. You had the Korean War. You're going to have the Vietnam War. There are continued crises in Asia. So Asia's always kind of a Cold War, hot war, Cold War verging on, or Cold War turning into hot war situation. And China remains, you know, a very contentious area. Remember, the U.S. didn't want Mao Zedong to win. He did. What does Mao do barely a year after he wins? He intervenes in Korea and fights against American forces there. So the United States develops what it calls two China policy. It will continue to oppose the People's Republic of China. At the United Nations, the recognized government of China is still the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. All right? So the U.S. two China's policy means simply it will not recognize and it will continue to try to contain the Communist People's Republic of China while it continues to support Jiang Jiechi, who had fled to Taiwan. All right? This will become a problem in trying to maintain this two China's policy. The U.S. stakes not only its prestige but actually its resources. Kind of, you sent an email out about the other day. The U.S. sent the 7th Fleet, big, huge naval armada, to the defense of Taiwan. All right. Taiwan is an offshore island. Let me see which map this is. Okay, well, here's Taiwan. That's good enough. It looks better up there than it does on my screen. Okay, here's Taiwan, which, as you can see, is offshore from the mainland. Not terribly far, much smaller, of course. All right. Jiang Jiechi had retreated to Taiwan with most of the Chinese treasury to keep his Kuomintang regime alive. The Americans see Taiwan both as a real and symbolic aspect of the Cold War. I mean, it's really there, but symbolically it's important for the U.S. to hold on to Taiwan to keep it independent, because Mao Zedong claims that Taiwan is actually part of China and that the Chinese should, you know, also have control of Taiwan. All right? And why is the U.S. still committed and concerned about this region? It's still part of the open door system, right? The open door notes. However, this region, you know, poses great risks. In both 1955 and 58, the United States and China almost went to war. The Kuomintang had kept control over really tiny offshore islands called Matsu and Quemoy. They're really tiny. I don't even know if you can actually see them up there, but they're real small, Quemoy and Matsu. Jiang Jiechi was using these small islands to stage commando raids against the Chinese. By itself, these commando raids don't amount to much, but Jiang Jiechi also has a very sizable arsenal that he has received from the United States, which from Quemoy or Matsu could cause problems. He could use that to harass the mainland. Mao Zedong establishes a blockade and begins to shell these two islands. The United States, you know, is in a quandary. I mean, do you risk war against China over two really tiny islands? Well, the U.S. does. It comes to the defense of Quemoy and Matsu, threatens military strikes against the People's Republic of China if they threaten Taiwan. So already, these two small islands become an area in which, Dulles is willing to risk war. Dulles says the U.S. has to be prepared to take a risk of war with China if we're going to stay in the Far East. If we're not willing to take that risk, all right, let's make that decision and get out, and we'll make our defense in California. It's kind of like, kind of a whiny, I'm taking my ball and go home kind of thing. If we don't stop them in Quemoy and Matsu, we're going to have to fight them in California kind of thing, which is really preposterous. But Eisenhower says we have to be prepared to take a risk of war with China, okay? And this is in 1955. Congress then enacted the Formosa Straits Resolution, which gave Eisenhower the authority to protect Taiwan, all right? Some military people even advised using low-yield nuclear weapons. Eisenhower, luckily, took a very less aggressive approach. And the People's Republic of China, what did it do? It backed down, not unlike Stalin in Iran or in Berlin. Mao Zedong backed down. Now, at the same time, Jiang Jiechi was talking about reunifying China under his rule. And the U.S. did tell him to shut up. It's like, keep your mouth shut, because the idea of Jiang going back and retaking China was preposterous, and he continued these illusions until he died. All right. So a war had been averted, but at the same time, the U.S. showed the lengths to which it was willing to go to protect its interests there in Quemoy and Taiwan, at Quemoy and Matsu. All right. I want to jump around a little bit to South Asia. I'm going to skip the Japan stuff. Okay. Okay. You all know how India and Pakistan kind of became where they were. Pakistan broke off. Right? India is a Hindu state. Pakistan is Muslim. And right after the decolonization, actually, it was still Gandhi, right, who allowed the Muslims to break off and form their own country, Pakistan. So the United States is involved in this region and always had kind of an ambivalent relationship with India. And in 1955, at this conference at Bandung, the Indians, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, played a major role. You're probably familiar with this name. Nehru, who was the Prime Minister of India, was much like Nasser or Sukarno in Indonesia, believed in neutralism. Nehru had some problems with the Americans. He believed, pretty much correctly, that they wanted to replace the British as the dominant Western power in South Asia. And he believed that the U.S. was exaggerating the Soviet threat in order to get its way and to deter nationalism in the Third World. Pretty much right there, too. He also was upset because American aid and international institutions like the IMF and World Bank only gave money out to what kind of institutions? IMF money, private, right? And Nehru wants to develop a state economy because he believes that he can develop and modernize better that way. But you can't get American loans, you can't get American money if you have state industry or state communications or whatever, okay? So the American ambassador said that he believed Nehru feared the spread of Americanism much more than the threat or the spread of communism. Nehru was not a communist, but he did fear American capitalism. There's no question about that. He also maintained good relationships with communist as well as non-aligned countries too. The U.S. sees Nehru much as it sees Nasser. He's a nationalist, he's neutral, he's not trustworthy, he's not on our side, he's probably an enemy. In fact, the Indians were selling chemicals and other kinds of equipment that the Chinese theoretically could have used for put military application, so the U.S. takes action against that. it threatens to withhold any kind of aid to Nehru. And Nehru says India will never submit to surrendering its sovereignty. So you can see the U.S. and India have really, kind of sketchy, squirrely relations from the beginning. And by the 50s, the mid-1950s, India's complaints grow stronger. The United States formed a counterpart to NATO in Southeast Asia called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And Nehru was furious at that. Nehru believes, remember what Nasser had said, all this hammering at PACs? Nehru basically believes the same thing, that these regional arrangements like the Baghdad Pact or NATO or SEATO are intended to kind of solidify American hegemony and keep other countries in that region on notice that they better do things the American way, and if not, there's the threat of military force being used against them. And again, that was the point of SEATO and NATO and the Nehru Pact, NATO, SEATO, and the Baghdad Pact. Nehru even visited Moscow, which infuriated the United States. One newspaper said that Nehru was the prime minister of an avowed red satellite with Moscow's noose around his neck because he had traveled there, right? So the U.S. was deeply concerned that India would basically become a Soviet client state, or at least clearly untrustworthy in the larger context of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was offering India development aid and even talked about sending military equipment to New Delhi. So the United States grows more and more concerned about that. Eisenhower at one point says he's willing to support India if it is, quote, neutral on our side. All right? So this is what neutrality means to us. You have to be neutral on our side, right? So this is by the mid-1950s. The United States is increasingly skeptical about India. Congressmen refuse to give India aid because it is not a worthy ally. It's not even a worthy neutral on our side. So relationships in South Asia become rockier and rockier. What does the U.S. do? It has to find a counterbalance to India. What's it going to do? It's going to turn toward Pakistan, and we'll finish that up next time. All right.